Now it's time for perspective. And what have African forest elephants, leatherback turtles in Guyana and river trout in mainland France got in common? Well, the answer is that all three have been highlighted in the latest Living Planet report from the Worldwide Fund for Nature. They are linked, as you might have guessed, in a far from positive way, as the report says they are part of a long list of endangered species in that report that says that 73% of wild vertebrate populations have declined since 1970 alone. Now, that report is global. Environmental leaders gather in Colombia for COP16. It's the UN's biodiversity conference. Well, joining me here on set is Chief Executive Officer for the WWF here in France, Véronique Andrieux. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today. First of all, then, tell us what your report says about wild vertebrate populations.
Well, we can see a steep decline in wildlife populations, on average 73% in the past 50 years. So that tells us that we are failing to bend the curve of nature loss, and that the key drivers remain unabated, in particular unsustainable food production and consumption.
I mean, it's interesting seeing the report as well. You kind of get used, if you like, if that's the right word, to hearing about African elephants, to hearing about leatherback turtles, that kind of thing. But you even, talk about river trout, for example, here in France.
Yes, indeed. Well, some species are really, we achieve to maintain some species stable, some others even increase, but that remain like kind of isolated cases. The overall trend is a decrease, steep decrease, and indeed the trout is a very good example, over 50% lost. And also, well, in other regions, other geographies suffer the worst decline, in particular Latin American and the Caribbean, and indeed freshwater species.
I mean, it's incredible, those figures, isn't it? 50% decline in 50 years. I mean, when you look ahead, how pessimistic does that make you?
Well, we definitely need to engage in collective action. It is urgent, and we need action at scale. And we know the solutions. I mean, as I said, the drivers are known. Like the IPBES says, it's mainly the unsustainable food production and consumption. It's also natural resources overexploitation and climate change. So we definitely need to reset the food system, in particular by eating more plant-based protein and also by shifting to agroecological transition. We know that the industrial intensive agriculture model today is responsible for 80% of the deforestation, 70% of water use, and 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we know the solutions.
Is that viable, though? I mean, to persuade people, if you like, to change their diets?
Well, it is about behavioral change, but the main responsibility lies within governments and business and corporates. So that's where the pressure needs to be. And actually, the COP16 is opening today for 2 weeks of negotiations, and it is an implementation COP. As you remember, in 2022, there was the Kunming-Montreal Agreement with fairly specific targets on all sectors that drive nature loss, including agriculture and diets. So yes, it can be done.
It can be done, but in 2 years, has anything been done? As you say, a lot of agreements were reached. Now, 2 years on, we're having an implementation conference. Does that not show that actually not much has changed in 2 years?
Well, indeed, at WWF, we've been tracking the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And what we see is that there's only about 10% of countries that have really submitted a decent NBSAP, a decent strategy and targets aligned with global biodiversity frameworks objectives. So we're putting pressure so that governments deliver. There's also a key challenge around funding. Funding needs to be poured into developing countries, and so that's a responsibility of rich countries like ours in France.
Picking up something you said there, only 10% of countries. I mean, does that not show that the COP, whole idea of the COPs just doesn't work?
Well, most of the work is done in the last minutes and last days before the COP, so we'll have to see. But yes, indeed, it is very important to keep up the pressure and also to make sure that there is funding so that these national objectives can be delivered against. We're also putting pressure so that these strategies and action plans have, well, the right funding allocated, but also very specific targets, and that they encompass many sectors, including agriculture, mining, infrastructure, and so on.
How do you keep people's minds on the ecological problem? I mean, at the moment, we've been reporting just over the last half hour, the latest situation in Ukraine, the latest situation in Gaza, the latest situation in Lebanon. Does the environmental issue, if you like, get put on the back burner too much, do you think?
Well, indeed, that's what we've been seeing, in particular in France, in Europe, and actually, I would say across the world. Indeed, we're living in a multi-crisis environment, and so it's easily the climate and nature crises go through the cracks. But it is our responsibility to really understand that this is, the challenge of our generation. And indeed, for instance, when we release the Living Planet report, the Living Planet Index, this abundance index is an early warning indicator of the extinction risk. And when we say species, natural habitats, it is actually about us that we're talking, because we just can't deliver without healthy ecosystems. It is 80% of the Sustainable Development Goals that are at stake if nature is not thriving, and it is over 50% of the global GDP. So it is really us that we're putting in danger by not delivering against nature targets.
Yeah, one of those phrases that you use is tipping point, saying that that's really what we're getting to, and it's a phrase we hear a lot, isn't it? Is this the crucial tipping point, if you like, that we're at now?
Well, a tipping point is like, when for one of us, like getting into a burnout, and indeed nature is on the brink to burnout. And we see that in a number of spots, like for instance, the Amazon rainforest. We've lost 17% of it already. And the threshold of 20-25% would mean a tipping point. And that would mean that the rainforest would not be able, for instance, to play ecosystem services and its functions like carbon storage, for instance, and perform as a climate mitigation driver. So indeed, it is. We're kind of, there is probably, a likelihood that we are getting close to some of those tipping points, provided that we keep business as usual and the current trends continue.
Good to have you with us on the programme today. Thank you very much for coming in and talking to us. Véronique Andrieux, Chief Executive Officer for the Worldwide Fund for Nature here in France. Thank you very much.